Hey everyone, I'm excited to take a look today at the new book by Ed Uszynski, Untangling Critical Race Theory, printed by University Press. Thank you to IVP for sending me this for review. This is my honest take on the book. So let me take you through my typical format of the main idea of the book, the research behind the project, the readability of its style, and then just some of my general reactions to it. So let's dive in. I've been looking forward to this one for a bit since I've heard a few interviews with Ed Uszynski, particularly on Preston Sprinkle's podcast. I've found him to be a provocative and thoughtful kind of explicator of critical theory, cultural studies, that kind of area of academic theory and cultural theory work. And so I was really intrigued by this book. And if you've been following any of my reviews for a while, you know that I tend to read a good bit on cultural theory, and especially on race and history and critical race theory as well. That's just been an interest of mine for some time. So anyways, I was just very interested in this book, very keenly interested to see what he would bring to this whole conversation that's been roiling, particularly in more conservative Christian evangelical circles for a while. So the main idea then of this book is, this is, in a lot of ways, I think it's fair to say this is a book that is aimed at most likely a broadly white evangelical or conservative adjacent, evangelical adjacent audience. I think that audience of people is primarily who he is writing for people who maybe have heard about critical race theory, have maybe heard it decried or critiqued relentlessly, but maybe don't know what it actually really is. And importantly for people, I think an audience for this book is people who are open to learning about more of what it actually is and are not looking for more just ammunition in debates or especially culture war kind of dialogue. I think this book is primarily, I think it's fair to say this is primarily written towards that audience. And it's, in many ways, I hesitate to say that it's an apologetic for critical race theory or strictly a defense of critical race theory, but it does lean, I'll say more about this in my reaction at the end, it leans more in a direction of defending the more academic, careful explicators of critical race theory, and at minimum kind of presenting critical race theory as very complex, very diverse within itself area of study and research. So anyways, I'm starting to get into my reactions a little bit too much. I'm going to try to rein that in and just present what the book is first. That title, Untangling Critical Race Theory, with everything I just said in mind, should give you a sense of what is going on here. He really is trying to present critical race theory for what it is and untangle it, decode it for the person who's uninitiated, explain some of its tenets, explain the historical context of it, get into some of the background and the cultural precedents for why it emerged, when it emerged. All of that stuff is kind of wrapped up in this project, and I think the goal of the book is, at the end of the day, for someone who maybe knows little to nothing about what critical race theory actually is, to put down this book and have some grasp of what it is, who has been the primary scholars involved in it, what it's actually saying, what it's not saying, some grasp of what maybe irresponsible uses of critical race theory could look like, and more than anything, just hopefully some kind of an appreciation and a more of a nuanced perspective on what this thing is that so many people are so up in arms about, and maybe even also some understanding of where some of the misrepresentations in the culture war rhetoric come from. So it's all of that's kind of bound up in Untangling Critical Race Theory, and it is particularly, I should have emphasized this more, it is more explicitly written for Christians, although I definitely don't think you need to be a Christian to appreciate this if you're someone who wouldn't consider yourself a religious or person of faith, but you're really interested in critical race theory. I think actually pretty much anybody could appreciate this book. So that was a lot on the main idea. But let me get into the research behind this now. There's kind of really two areas of research in this, maybe three-ish, but one is obviously critical race theory. So Ed Uszynski is someone who has read and studied critical race theory directly, thankfully. He gets it. He has read the Derek Bells and the Kimberly Crenshaws. He understands intersectionality. He understands where all these ideas come from. And he studied them, the original texts in their context, He knows the biographies of some of the scholars. So a lot of the research is directly rooted in critical race theory itself, critical legal studies more broadly. And he quotes things directly. He is not repeating talking points from secondary sources or summaries of these sources. He's interacting directly with the scholars. So that's one area of research. Another area of research is more generally critical theory and Marxist thought, which this was I would say for me, a kind of a pleasant surprise. I'll say more about this in my reaction, but the intro chapters actually have more to do with general Marxist philosophy and theory, and also then critical theory, the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, Adorno, that whole school of thought, Walter Benjamin, so on and so forth. As those are things just swirling around in the cultural kind of context from which CRT arises. And so he spends a few chapters patiently walking the reader through what these things are. And I was surprised by that. I wasn't expecting that. I expected this strictly to be about critical race theory, but I really liked those chapters, and I thought he did a great job representing Marxism, critical theory. I mean, all this stuff is notoriously hard to summarize, but I think he does a patient and careful and deliberate job stepping through fair representations of what those things are. And again, he roots it directly in the text. I mean, he did his PhD in cultural studies, and so he spent a lot of time swimming in these currents, and he does a great job representing them. So that's another area. So critical race theory itself, more broadly, Marxist critical theory scholarship is another one. And then the third area of research is he does get into current events, and particularly he gets into some clapbacks or responses to so-called CRT or wokeness or whatever. He, particularly as they've arisen in conservative Christianity, so people like Christopher Rufo, for example, he talks about some of these figures who have, or Neil Shenvi, he interacts with some of Neil Shenvi's work. These figures who have arisen as like stridently critical of what they see as wokeness or theological drift or whatever, social justice. Vodi Bachum's another one he talks about. So there's this whole area of research in which he is directly responding to claims that these critics are making. And I think he does this is one of the things I liked about the book a lot. I almost wish there was more of it. I think he does a great job responding to those voices. Really, really good. There's one section in particular where he takes on a pretty famous piece that was co-authored by Neil Shenvi, and I can't remember the other guy's name. And he does a really, really great job critically responding to the way that they frame the debate. And that I love that section in particular, and I like his ability to interact with those voices as well in the book. So that was another nice kind of element of the research. So he pulls on these current events and these current writings, and he cites them directly. So he's not straw-manning, to my best understanding, he's not straw-manning or misrepresenting these views. He's citing them directly. You can chase anything down that he cites because he represents it clearly, and it's footnoted and all that stuff. So yeah, really, really solid. You can tell I'm enjoying this book, or I have enjoyed this book. Okay, the next thing, readability. I'm going to try to do this quickly. This is getting a little longer than I meant to, but the readability of this is it's very readable. It leans in a more of a reflective, autobiographical at times, conversational style. It is not dense academic, inscrutable style prose at all. It does get a little thinky. There are a couple chapters that do really slowly walk you through some precepts and pillars of these things. So if you're 100% uninitiated, if you've never read any of Marx or Horkheimer or what, if you're 100% fresh to all this stuff, some of the chapters might get a little you got to kind of work your way through it. But I found it. I've read a good bit of this stuff, so I found it really a breeze to read. I read it in, I think, 2 days. And then that's because of the style. It's the first chapter is autobiographical, strictly memoirish reflections, and he threads that through a lot of the chapters, particular conversations he's had, events he's attended, talks he's sat through. So he tells stories and that always helps kind of bring a reader through a book like this. So I would say highly readable, with that caveat. If you've no initiation in any of the theory at work here, then there might be a few things that you might need to reread or kind of chew through for a bit, but highly readable overall. No concerns there from my perspective. I would give this to most people in my congregation, for example, if they have questions about this, and I wouldn't be worried about whether or not they could understand it. Okay, so that gets to my reaction. You've heard me tip my hand a little bit to my reactions here. My reactions to this book are positive. I really, really like this book. But what I want to do in this reaction is I want to try to situate this book. I already did this a little bit in the intro about who I think this book is for, but I want to try to situate this amongst other texts. In particular, there's another one. I meant to grab it off my shelf earlier, but there's another one called, I'll put the image up, Christianity and Critical Race Theory by Romero and Chu. I want to put this book kind of alongside that one because I know some people are wondering, like, how do these books are these books complementary? Do you need both, et cetera, et cetera? Well, I think both are great, and I don't think that either of them substitutes for the other, actually. So what Uszynski is doing in this book is an extraordinarily helpful resource, again, for those people I mentioned at the beginning, maybe people who are resistant to critical race theory, who are worried about quote-unquote wokeness, people who maybe listen more to those right-wing cultural commentators like a Rufo or less extreme ones, people who just only listen to those people. I would say someone like Neil Shenvi is more thoughtful, but still in that side of things, who is out to critique and respond and react. If someone only listens to all that stuff, I think that this book is going to be really challenging for them, but I think it's precisely the best kind of audience for this book because he understands that audience. He walks through the theories really patiently, very clearly. He's very knowledgeable, and I think he does an effective job at representing them fairly, and I think stepping through these critiques. So, whereas the other book that I mentioned, Christianity and Critical Race Theory, it's not so much geared towards that type of audience. It's more of an exploration of that other book is more of an exploration of specific ideas within critical race theory and how they can be overlapped with a broadly Christian framework. So it's more of an exploration. It takes for granted that critical race theory is worth exploring and taking seriously, and then explores it within how that can look within a Christian framework. This is more of a step before that, which is to say, here's why you shouldn't be afraid of critical race theory, basically. Here's why some of the critiques are not valid of it. Here's what it actually is. Here is how it is and is not related to Marxism. Here is how historically it arose from within these other cultural phenomena. And here is some ways in which it overlaps with some kind of quasi-Marxian concerns, but here's other ways in which it's very different and why it needs to be taken, account of on its own merits. He also and he can say this because he is someone who grew up conservative evangelical. He is a white man in a parachurch ministry, vocationally, and he can speak very confidently to here is where the broadly white evangelical American cultural group has largely lost the plot when it comes to these racial conversations or conversations about race and racialism and racism and the historicity of all that stuff. He can speak very boldly and prophetically to that community, and so he does. And he talks, I think, very fairly. And he's not like saber rattling or just being overly agitated or anything like that. He's, I think, being appropriately prophetic, which is to say, here are ways that the community has acted that they've missed central kind of voices in this conversation. And here is how taking critical race theory seriously as an analytic tool and as one lens, not as a totalizing or absolutizing worldview, but here's how it can look, and he models that, I think, in this book really effectively. And so they're different resources. I think they're very complementary. I'm glad to have both on my shelf. I think they're both helpful. So I wanted to speak to that in my reaction. A couple of the specific things I want to say about this, like there's a few chapters I really like. There's a chapter specifically on the tenets of critical race theory, which again are notoriously hard to summarize. It's really hard to get into here's the 5 pillars of it, for example, because it's so wildly diverse. But what he does really well is he takes each tenet as he sees it and he explains what it is. He explains how it he explains the kind of the best faith representation of that tenet, and he also explains, I think really wisely, he says this is what it looks like when that particular idea does go too far. So he does acknowledge some of the excesses of some of the ideas that can be carried out, especially on a pop level or popular level or watered down level. He acknowledges how things can be mishandled in poorly led trainings. He sat through poorly led trainings, DEI trainings himself. He gets all of that stuff and he acknowledges it, but he never lets the pendulum swing too far, and he still tries to peel back. Here is what at core is the actual helpful idea underneath this. And that chapter in particular I thought was really great. I mentioned that I really liked that he does include the chapter on Marx and the 2 chapters I think on critical theory more broadly. Really helpful. I think those are all things that more people, especially in conservative Christianity in America, more people need to just understand. You don't have to be an expert in it, but you just got to understand that stuff is swirling around if you want to have an opinion on something like critical race theory. So all that stuff is great. And there's one more thing I want to point out in my reaction before I wrap this up. Already gotten longer than I meant to, but I kind of knew that might happen with this book because this topic is such a lightning rod. One more thing I want to say, that this also surprised me, but in a positive way. He spends a lot of time exploring almost the psychology of the culture war around this. It comes up, and I might have organized the book slightly differently if I was editing it. I might have moved these chapters, because he kind of circles back to this idea of why do certain people react the way they do to critical race theory and others not. I might have moved some of that content to be all together in one section of the book rather than circling back to it, but that's a very, very minor quibble. What I do want to say is that I wasn't expecting that in the book, and I was really pleasantly surprised by it, and I think he does a fair job of, he kind of presents almost different quasi categories of people and the ways and how you can try to empathize and try to understand with where someone's coming from, and try to almost look past the debate and look into more of the underpinnings of, like, why is this person reacting so in a certain way to these ideas. And there's a lot more going on that has to do with discipleship and political formation and maybe even their personal story. Like, he explores all of that, and I think I actually found that really helpful. I was completely not expecting that in this book. I expected it to be a lot more about the theory itself and, like, representing the ideas. But I liked that. I thought that was a wise inclusion, and that also moves this book into a different category from the other one I mentioned, the Christianity and critical race theory. And so I thought that was really helpful. If you're someone who has read a lot of critical race theory, you're interested in it, and you're not quite sure how to have maybe more fruitful conversations, maybe you have people in your community or your family who are more representative of the, like, really harsh backlash to it. I think that those chapters and that content in this book will be genuinely helpful to you, as it was helpful for me. So yeah, man, there's a lot to appreciate about this book by Ed Uszynski and IVP, Untangling Critical Race Theory. It's, I think, very timely. It's very clear. It's very, very rooted in personal story and personal study from him. Has a lot of credibility, lends a lot of credibility to his voice. And I think that he handles this whole thing with a lot of wisdom, a lot of grace. But he never gives up on kind of his bold confidence that we meaning conservative evangelicals in America, need to do a better job at interacting with these issues. And I think his book is a great example of modeling just what that better job looks like. So thank you, Ed Uszynski, for writing this. Thank you, IVP, for putting it out. Thank you for taking some time to watch, as always.